two children in different villages, separated by mountains and speaking different languages, independently create identical games with identical rules without ever meeting. What explains this apparent coincidence? Now multiply this phenomenon across every major civilization throughout human history, all independently documenting identical magical abilities and identical techniques for developing these abilities without cultural exchange. This universal recognition across isolated traditions points to something beyond cultural invention or coincidence. When shamanic traditions in the Amazon, yogic systems in India, indigenous practices in North America, and Taoist methods in China all identify identical abilities and methods. Despite geographic separation, we're witnessing documentation of objective reality experienced directly. What you call magic has never been separate from you. Every power you've been told is supernatural or impossible is natural human capacity that's been intentionally hidden from your awareness. The systematic eradication of this knowledge wasn't accidental. It was a calculated effort to disconnect you from your power. Consider why these abilities were labeled witchcraft or heresy and punished by death. Ask yourself who benefits when billions of humans believe they're limited, powerless creatures rather than expressions of infinite consciousness capable of extraordinary perception and creation. Throughout history, those who maintained access to these abilities were systematically eliminated. The witch hunts of Europe weren't about superstition. They targeted the remnants of ancient knowledge systems, particularly women who preserved nature-based wisdom traditions. Over 9 million people were executed, most possessing genuine knowledge of energy manipulation and consciousness expansion techniques. But wait, you might say, if these abilities are real, why can't they be measured scientifically? The truth, they can and increasingly are. Modern physics obliterates the division between science and magic completely. Quantum mechanics demonstrates that observation fundamentally alters reality at the subatomic level. The observer effect isn't a scientific curiosity. It proves that consciousness directly influences material reality, exactly as ancient traditions claimed for thousands of years. The human body contains electromagnetic fields that modern science can measure but cannot fully explain. These bioelectric fields, generated by your heart, brain, and cellular systems, create patterns that extend beyond physical boundaries, influencing and being influenced by energetic exchanges science has only begun to recognize. Your heart generates an electromagnetic field 500 times stronger than your brain, measurable up to 10 feet away with sensitive equipment. The HeartMath Institute has documented that these fields transmit information between humans without conventional communication, providing scientific validation for what ancient traditions called telepathy or psychic connection. The pineal gland represents the physical intersection between consciousness and biochemistry. Located directly in the geometric center of your brain, this pine cone-shaped gland produces melatonin, serotonin, and dimethyltryptamine, DMT, compounds that directly affect perception, awareness, and consciousness states. Modern research confirms what ancient traditions documented. The pineal gland contains photoreceptors identical to those in your retina, despite being encased in darkness. These receptors respond to light that never reaches them through conventional means, suggestive of perception beyond ordinary sensory limitations. This isn't mystical speculation, but documented biology without conventional explanation. Yet this gland calcifies progressively through exposure to fluoride, aluminum, and other environmental toxins, substances that have dramatically increased in the modern environment. The correlation between pineal calcification and diminished perceptual abilities appears across multiple studies. This biological mechanism explains how modern environments systematically suppress the natural human capacity for expanded perception. But if this suppression is real, you might ask, wouldn't we see evidence across different cultures? Exactly, and we do. Consider the role of the pineal gland across traditions. The ancient Egyptians represented it as the eye of Heru. Hinduism depicted it as the third eye chakra. Greek traditions called it the seat of the soul. These weren't poetic metaphors, but precise identifications of the physical structure associated with expanded perception. They recognized identical function despite having no contact with each other. The techniques for activating this center show equally striking similarities. Focusing attention between the eyebrows, specific breathing patterns, sound vibrations at particular frequencies. These techniques appear across traditions worldwide not because they were transmitted between cultures, but because they address the same biological and energetic mechanisms. Of course, some would argue these are merely coincidental similarities born from shared human biology. But this explanation fails to account for the extraordinary specificity of these correspondences. Not general similarities, but identical techniques producing identical results across isolated traditions. The probability of this occurring through coincidence approaches zero. If you really feel something in your heart as I speak, give us a like and subscribe. I'm going to continue to help you. Now look at what modern science has begun to validate, what these ancient traditions documented through direct experience. The pineal gland does contain photoreceptors identical to those in the retina. The heart does generate electromagnetic fields that transmit information beyond the body. Consciousness does influence matter at the quantum level. The abilities described in ancient texts aren't supernatural. They represent the natural functioning of consciousness when artificial limitations are removed. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali describe specific abilities, siddhis, that naturally manifest when consciousness returns to its original state. Abilities including telepathy, clairvoyance, and direct influence over matter. But we've been conditioned to dismiss these capacities as impossible despite substantial evidence. The most effective prison is one where prisoners don't see the walls and mock anyone who points them out. Your perception has been deliberately limited through education systems that ridicule expanded awareness, religions that demonize inner power, and scientific paradigms that deny consciousness itself. But surely, you might counter, if these abilities were real, we'd see more evidence in daily life. This overlooks how thoroughly these abilities have been suppressed through multiple mechanisms. The cultural conditioning that labels these capacities impossible creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. People don't develop what they believe cannot exist. The biological suppression through environmental toxins directly inhibits the physical systems supporting expanded perception. The energetic disruption through electromagnetic pollution further diminishes natural human capacity. Yet, despite this multi-layered suppression, these abilities continue to emerge. People experience spontaneous moments of expanded perception, intuitive flashes, seeming coincidences that defy probability, direct knowing without logical process. These moments represent your natural capacity functioning despite systematic suppression. The scientific evidence creates uncomfortable questions for the materialist paradigm. Why does a gland in the center of the brain contain light receptors that never receive external light? Why does this same gland produce DMT, the compound associated with mystical experiences, near-death phenomena, and expanded perception? The answers point toward capacities that conventional science has systematically ignored. Your DNA itself demonstrates properties that defy conventional explanation. Recent research documents that DNA emits coherent photons, measurable light that appears to transmit information between cells without conventional chemical signaling. This biophotonic communication provides another mechanism through which consciousness influences biological systems in ways previously dismissed as impossible. Comment below if you felt that shift in consciousness when I mentioned how different traditions worldwide recognized identical abilities. So, if you think about the implications, you'll recognize that these capacities represent your natural heritage rather than supernatural abilities. What's been suppressed is your normal functioning rather than extraordinary capacities. But this sounds like pseudoscience, some might object. Perhaps if you limit science to what currently fits within materialist paradigms. Yet throughout history, today's established science was yesterday's pseudoscience. When quantum physicists as renowned as Max Planck conclude that mind is the matrix of all matter and consciousness must be considered fundamental rather than derivative, perhaps the paradigm itself requires expansion rather than defense. The practical restoration process combines multiple approaches. First, detoxify the biological systems, particularly the pineal gland, through specific protocols that remove calcification and restore optimal function. Second, implement electromagnetic coherence practices that reorganize your bioelectric fields into patterns that support expanded perception. Third, apply specific attention techniques that activate dormant neural networks associated with non-ordinary perception. The detoxification process begins with eliminating substances that directly contribute to pineal calcification, fluoride, aluminum, calcium phosphate, and other compounds found in processed foods, tap water, and common medications. Specific detoxification protocols then remove accumulated calcification, tamarind extract, iodine supplementation, and other approaches supported by clinical research. But you might wonder, how do we know these detoxification protocols actually work? Valid question. The evidence comes from both clinical research and consistent results across practitioners. Studies show that iodine supplementation promotes elimination of fluoride and bromide, halides that directly contribute to pineal calcification. Tamarind extract has demonstrated effectiveness in fluoride removal, according to multiple peer-reviewed studies. The results appear consistently across diverse populations. The energetic component requires equally specific approaches. Heart coherence techniques, where breath and attention patterns create coherent heart field patterns, establish the energetic foundation for expanded perception. These techniques create measurable changes in heart rate variability that correlate directly with enhanced intuitive ability, according to HeartMath Institute research. Every tradition recognized that purification precedes activation. The physical system must be cleared of substances that calcify the pineal gland and disrupt energetic coherence. The emotional system must be cleared of reactive patterns that consume attention energy. The mental system must be cleared of limiting beliefs that create perceptual filters. These preliminary steps aren't mysterious but practical preparations for expanded function. The activation practices show equally consistent patterns. Attention directed to the center of the forehead stimulates pineal function. Specific breathing patterns alter brain chemistry and energy flow. Sound vibrations at particular frequencies resonate with brain structures to enhance coherence. These techniques weren't symbolic rituals, but precise technologies for enhancing natural human capacity. This all sounds too simple, you might think. If these techniques were this effective, wouldn't everyone be using them? Fair point, but consider how thoroughly these practices have been suppressed, ridiculed, and obscured. The simplicity of these techniques doesn't diminish their effectiveness, but highlights how accessible these capacities remain despite systematic suppression. The results emerge gradually for most practitioners, though some experience dramatic shifts in perception. As the biological systems regenerate and energetic coherence builds, perceptual abilities expand accordingly. The process follows natural development patterns rather than magical thinking, each step building on previous preparation in systematic progression. Begin with simple practices documented across traditions worldwide. 15 minutes daily focusing attention at the center of the forehead. Specific breathing patterns that alter brain chemistry and energy flow, eliminating substances that calcify the pineal gland and disrupt energetic coherence. These practices initiate the reclamation process according to natural laws rather than requiring belief or faith. The universal traditions distinguished between abilities that emerge naturally through consciousness development and those forced through technique without wisdom. The former emerge within ethical frameworks that benefit rather than exploit. The latter often become destructive because they operate from separate identity rather than recognized unity. This distinction explains why genuine traditions emphasized character development alongside capacity development. But wait, you might ask, if these abilities can be misused, should we be developing them at all? Important question. The development of capacity without corresponding wisdom often creates harm rather than benefit. The ethical dimension isn't arbitrary restriction but practical necessity. These abilities function optimally within awareness that recognizes the interconnected nature of reality rather than separate identity-seeking advantage. The awakening process isn't instantaneous for most. The systems of suppression created layers of conditioning that must be systematically dismantled. The process requires commitment, daily practices that gradually restore natural perception and ability. Yet some experience spontaneous activation through trauma, near-death experiences, or sometimes without apparent cause. The ultimate irony? These magical abilities turn out to be completely natural, the ordinary functioning of consciousness when artificial limitations dissolve. What seems supernatural from limited perception is simply the natural capacity of consciousness, operating without artificial constraints. You never lost your inherent abilities. You simply accepted a story about what's possible that serves interests other than your own. Reclaiming these abilities doesn't require believing new stories but questioning the limitations you've accepted without investigation. The choice remains yours. Continue accepting artificial limitations imposed by systems that require your diminished capacity, or begin the systematic process of reclaiming what's been hidden from you. The techniques exist, preserved despite attempts to eradicate them. The capacity remains within you, dormant but intact. The evidence exists, both in ancient documentation and modern cases that defy conventional explanation. Those who maintain these abilities despite systematic suppression demonstrate what's possible when artificial limitations dissolve. They aren't special or chosen. They've simply remembered what others have forgotten. The awakening is already happening collectively. More humans are spontaneously experiencing expanded perception than at any time in recorded history. What was systematically suppressed is systematically returning. The question isn't whether these abilities exist, but whether you'll accept their emergence within your own experience. The reclamation process accelerates as you recognize that these abilities represent your natural heritage rather than supernatural capacities. What's been suppressed isn't extraordinary ability but ordinary function. The systematic removal of artificial limitations reveals what's always been present, rather than creating something new or separate. The universal recognition of these abilities throughout human history stands as testimony to their reality. When every major civilization documents identical observations, despite having no contact with each other, we're witnessing the documentation of objective reality rather than cultural fabrication. Your reclamation of these abilities represents not the development of something new, but the remembering of something ancient. your natural capacity as consciousness experiencing itself through human form.